Hello everyone and welcome to Chapter 2 of Paddington Takes the Air. I'm Anjali, this is Harley, and happily I've placed the book as a sunshade for him. Chapter 2 is called A Stitch in Time. Mrs. Bird held a large square of checkered cloth up to the light and examined it with an expert eye. "I must say Paddington's made a first-class job of it," she declared approvingly. "I've seen worse in some shops," agreed Mrs. Brown. "What is it?" "I think he said it's a tablecloth," replied Mrs. Bird. "But whatever it is, I'm sure it'll come in very handy." Mrs. Brown glanced up at the ceiling as a steady, rhythmic clanking came from somewhere overhead. "At least we can leave him on his own for the day without worrying too much," she said thankfully. "We may as well make the most of it. The rate he's going, that sewing machine won't last much longer." Mrs. Brown was never too happy about leaving Paddington on his own for too long. Things had a habit of going wrong, especially on days when he was at a loose end. But with Jonathan and Judy back at school after the Easter holiday, it couldn't always be avoided. It happened to be one of those days, and she was most relieved to know he was occupied. Paddington's interest in sewing had been something of a 9-day wonder in the Brown household. It all came about when he lost his 50p a week bun money going down a drain one morning as he was on his way to the baker's to pick up his standing order. The coin had slipped through a hole in one of his duffel coat pockets, and even the combined efforts of several passing dustmen and a road sweeper had failed to locate it. Although Mr. Brown took pity on him and replaced the money, Paddington had been upset for several days afterwards. He still felt he was going to be 50p short for the rest of his life, and when some men arrived a few days later to swill out the drains, he gave them some very hard stares indeed. It was Mr. Gruber who finally took his mind off the matter. Mr. Gruber kept an antique shop in the nearby Portobello Market, and over the years he and Paddington had become firm friends. In fact, most mornings they shared some buns and a cup of cocoa for their 11s. One morning, shortly after his loss, Paddington arrived at the shop only to find a mysterious cloth-covered object standing on a table just inside the door. At Mr. Gruber's bidding, he lifted the cloth and then nearly fell over backwards with surprise, for there, lo and behold, was a sewing machine, and even more exciting, on the side there was a label with his name on it. Mr. Gruber waved Paddington's thanks to one side. "We don't want another day like the one we don't want to talk about. In a hurry, Mr. Brown," he said, referring to Bunless Friday as they'd come to know it. "I'm afraid it's rather an old one," he continued as Paddington examined the machine with interest. "It came in a job lot I bought at a sale many years ago, and it's been lying under a chair at the back of my shop ever since. But there's a book of instructions, and it may do a turn if you want to go over some of your old seams." Paddington didn't know what to say. Although Mrs. Bird had unpicked the join on his duffel coat pocket and inserted a double-strength calico lining to make doubly sure for the future, he didn't want to take any more chances, and after thanking Mr. Gruber very much, he hurried home with the presents safely tucked away in his shopping basket on wheels. Paddington had often watched Mrs. Bird in action with her machine, and once she'd even let him turn the handle, but never, in his wildest dreams, had he actually pictured owning one himself. Threading the needle by paw had been his biggest problem, and the first aid had taken him the best part of the day. But once the cotton was safely through the eye of the needle, there was no holding him, and soon the steady clickety-clack of the machine had begun to echo round the house. At first he then contented himself with joining together some old bits of cloth Mrs. Bird had found in her sewing box. But when these ran out, he turned his attention to more ambitious things, and really and truly he'd been most useful. A new tea towel for Mrs. Bird, a set of curtains for Judy's dollhouse, a bag for Jonathan's cricket bat, and a smaller one for Mr. Brown's pipe. Now the tablecloth, there seemed no end to his activities. "Just so long as he doesn't do anything nasty to his new eiderdown," said Mrs. Bird, as they went upstairs to give Paddington his instructions for lunch. "I don't want to come back and find it turned into a tea cosy." Although the Browns' housekeeper was as pleased as anyone over Paddington's newfound industry, she didn't entirely share Mrs. Brown's optimism about leaving him alone for the day. Nevertheless, even Mrs. Bird gave a nod of approval as they entered his room, and she caught sight of a pile of old handkerchiefs he was busy repairing. "That reminds me," said Mrs. Brown as they said goodbye. "The laundryman is due this morning. I've put the things by the front door. Mr. Curry might call in later. He's got a pair of trousers he wants altered." Mrs. Bird gave a snort. "I shouldn't worry too much about that," she said meaningly. "It's only because there's a special offer of £1 off this week if repairs go with the laundry. If he's so mean he can't send any washing on his own, then it's too bad." There was little love lost between Mrs. Bird and the Browns' next-door neighbour, Mr. Curry. He had a reputation not only for his meanness, but for the way he seized every opportunity to take advantage of others. And the latest example lasted Mrs. Bird as a topic of conversation all the way to the bus stop. It seemed just a matter of seconds after the front door closed behind them that another loud bang sent Paddington hurrying downstairs, only to find Mr. Curry waiting impatiently on the front step. "Good morning, Bear," he said gruffly. "I'd like you to put these with the laundry." "I want 2 inches off the waist," he continued, handing over a pair of grey flannel trousers. "No more, and certainly no less. The instructions are all on a sheet of paper in one of the pockets. I lost a lot of weight when I was in hospital last year, and I've never put it on again. All my clothes are the same." "Oh dear, Mr. Curry," said Paddington. "I'm sorry to hear that." In saying he was sorry to hear about Mr. Curry's loss of weight, Paddington was speaking the truth, for ever since the unfortunate incident on the golf course, when he'd stepped on a marmalade sandwich and ended up in hospital, the Browns' neighbour had let no opportunity of mentioning the matter go by. But to Paddington's relief, for once Mr. Curry seemed to have his mind on other things. "I want you to make sure they go in your name," he said. "It's most important. They're doing waistbands for £1 this week, and it's the last day of the offer." A thoughtful expression came over Paddington's face as he took the trousers from Mr. Curry. "I know someone who would do it for 50p, he said hopefully, "and give it back to you today." 50p, repeated Mr. Curry. "Seems remarkably cheap. Are you sure they'll do them in a day?" Paddington nodded. "It isn't a they, Mr. Curry," he confided. "It's a he." "Is this person completely reliable, Bear?" asked Mr. Curry suspiciously. "I can hardly believe it." "Oh, yes," said Paddington confidently. "I've known him all my life. He lost his bun money down a drain the other day, and now he's trying to make up for it." Fortunately, Paddington's last words were lost on Mr. Curry, who seemed to be busy with his own thoughts. He hesitated for a moment and then came to a decision. "Wait there, Bear," he said, turning to go. "This is too good an opportunity to miss." The Browns' neighbour was gone for several minutes, and while he was away, the man arrived to collect the weekly wash. Paddington hesitated over the trousers. Although the idea of doing them himself had seemed a very good one at the time, now that he'd taken a closer look, he was beginning to have second thoughts on the matter, and he was about to chase after the van when he caught sight of Mr. Curry glaring at him through his bedroom window and hurriedly changed his mind again. A few moments later, the Browns' neighbour emerged from his front door and headed back towards number 32. To Paddington's surprise, he was wearing a dressing gown and carrying a large brown paper parcel in his arms. "I've decided to go the whole hog, Bear," he announced as he came up the path. "If this person's as good as you say he is, it'll be worthwhile." Paddington's face grew longer and longer as Mr. Curry unwrapped his parcel and revealed not one pair of trousers, but a great pile. In fact, outside of a shop, Paddington couldn't remember ever having seen quite so many pairs of trousers before. "I'm having the whole lot done," explained Mr. Curry, "including," he added ominously, "the ones from my best suit." "You wouldn't like to keep a pair in case of an emergency, would you, Mr. Curry?" asked Paddington anxiously. "An emergency?" barked Mr. Curry, catching sight of the look on Paddington's face. "I don't like the sound of that, Bear. Are you sure this person will do a good job? If not, I'd rather send them with your laundry." "I'm afraid it's too late now, Mr. Curry," said Paddington unhappily. "It's gone." Mr. Curry looked at Paddington sternly. "In that case," he warned, "I shall hold you personally responsible for the safety of my trousers from now on, and I shall look forward to their prompt return. I can't wait to go out until they come back, so woe betide you if anything goes wrong." "I may give you 50p for going," he added as Paddington held out his paw hopefully. "It all depends, but I'm certainly not paying the full amount until I see some results." With that, the Browns' neighbour turned on his heels and disappeared in the direction of his house, leaving Paddington with a very woe-begone expression on his face indeed. For some reason which he could never quite fathom, things around always got out of hand when Mr. Curry was around, and he was apt to find himself agreeing to do things before he knew what they actually were. Heaving a deep sigh, Paddington gathered up Mr. Curry's parcel and made his way back upstairs in order to consult the instruction book. Up to now, he'd concentrated on the mechanical side of the booklet, which explained the workings of the various parts. But towards the back, there were several chapters devoted to what one could do with the needle once it was threaded, and it was to this section that he'd turned when he settled down. But in the event, it proved rather disappointing. As far as he could make out, when the machine was first made, very few people seemed to wear trousers, or if they did, they were so well made they were seldom in need of repair. Most of the illustrations dealt with some very odd situations indeed. There was a picture of a lady who'd caught her dress on a penny farthing cycle, and another called Drama in the Desert, which showed a man with a large moustache and shorts repairing what was left of his tent after a camel had trodden on it. But any hints and tips to do with trousers as such were conspicuous only by their absence. Although Paddington was very keen on instruction books, he'd noticed in the past that they had a habit of dealing with every kind of situation except the one he wanted, and the present one was no exception. According to the closing paragraph, anyone who owned a sew-right sewing machine had unlimited horizons, but Paddington could see only two good things on his particular horizon. The Browns were out and unlikely to return for some while, and Mr. Curry was in and unlikely in his present state to venture out. However, Paddington wasn't the sort of bear to let things get the better of him, if he could possibly help it, and picking up a pair of scissors, he poked hopefully at one of Mr. Curry's seams. To his surprise, his efforts were rewarded much sooner than he expected, for without any warning at all, the waistband suddenly parted in the middle. In fact, it was even more successful than he'd intended, for when he pulled at the loose thread, there was a rending sound, and it travelled right down to the turn-ups at the bottom. Paddington wasn't quite sure whether it was the direct result of pulling that thread, or whether he'd pulled another one by mistake, but when he picked the trousers up to examine them more closely, one of the legs fell off. After drawing his bedroom curtains to be on the safe side, Paddington held the remaining leg up to his bedside light and peered at it uneasily. Now that matters had finally come to a head, he rather wished he'd sorted through the pile and picked on something other than the trousers from Mr. Curry's best navy blue pinstripe suit to practice on. On the other hand, when he looked at some of his efforts a little later on, he began to wonder if perhaps his first choice hadn't been the best one after all. At least the two halves had come apart cleanly, which was more than could be said for some of the older pairs of trousers. But it was when he tried sewing some of the halves together again that his troubles really started. It was much more difficult than he had expected. In the past, most of the material he'd used had been thin and easy to work, whereas Mr. Curry's trousers seemed unusually thick. There were so many folds in his waistbands he'd soon lost count of them, and the handle of the machine became very hard to turn. In desperation, Paddington tried jamming it in one of his dressing-table drawers and turning the machine itself. The only result of that was an ominous ping as the needle snapped. It was almost disappointing. After working away as hard as he could, with barely a pause for a marmalade sandwich at lunch, Paddington had to admit that the results fell somewhat short of even his own expectations, and he shuddered to think how far short they would be of Mr. Curry's. As far as he could see, all he could offer the Browns' neighbour was a choice between a pair of trousers with 30-centimetre hips and pockets on the outside, one with a large gap in the back, a pair of grey flannel shorts with one leg longer than the other, some trousers with different coloured legs, or a kind of do-it-yourself selection from the pieces that were left over. Whichever Mr. Curry chose, Paddington couldn't picture him being exactly overjoyed, let alone paying 50 pence a time. He looked at the pile of material mournfully. For a wild moment, he toyed with the idea of disguising his voice and ringing the Browns' neighbour to try and explain matters to him, but then he remembered Mr. Curry wasn't on the phone anyway. All the same, the thought triggered off another idea in Paddington's mind, and a moment later, after consulting his instruction book again, he hurried downstairs. In the back of the sew-right booklet was a note headed, "What to do if all else fails," and this was followed by an address to write to in case of an emergency. Paddington hoped very much that they'd had enough emergencies over the years to keep their service going and to have a telephone installed into the bargain, though he doubted very much if they could ever have had one quite as bad as his present one. The man from the sew-right emergency service stared round Paddington's room in amazement. "You're in a bit of a mess, and no mistake," he said sympathetically. "What on earth's been going on?" "I'm afraid I've been having trouble with Mr. Curry's seams," said Paddington. "I've got rather a lot of his legs left over." "I can see that," said the man, picking up a handful. "This sort of thing isn't really our pigeon," he continued doubtfully. "But I suppose I might be able to pull a few strings for you." "I've tried pulling some threads," said Paddington, "but it only seemed to make things worse." The man gave Paddington an odd look, and then glancing round the room again, he gave a sudden start. "Is that yours?" he asked, pointing to the machine on the floor. "Well, yes," began Paddington. "Mr. Gruber gave it to me. I'm afraid it's rather an old one, so you may not like it very much." "Not like it!" cried the man, dashing to the door. "Not like it! Jim!" he shouted. "Jim! There's a young bear up here with one of our mark ones!" Paddington grew more and more mystified as a pounding of feet on the stairs heralded the approach of a second man. He wasn't at all sure what was going on, but he was thankful to see something happening at long last. It had taken him several telephone calls and some long conversations to get the men from So Right to come in the first place. Even then, he hadn't been at all hopeful about the result, but as he listened to their comments, his eyes grew rounder and rounder. "Just you wait till our Mr. Bridges hears about this," exclaimed the first man as they made to leave. "He'll go berserk. You'll never hear the like again." "I expect I shall," said Paddington unhappily. "You wait until Mr. Curry hears about his trousers." Although the long-term prospects had begun to look much better than he dared expect, Paddington didn't view the immediate future at all hopefully, and as things turned out, his forecast proved all too correct. The roar of rage which issued from Mr. Curry's house a short while later, when the men from So Right broke the news about his trousers, followed him all the way down Windsor Gardens, lasting almost as far as the Portobello Road, and he was very thankful indeed to reach the safety of Mr. Gruber's shop. While Paddington sat on the horsehair sofa mopping his brow, Mr. Gruber hastily made some cocoa, and a few minutes later they adjourned to their usual deck chairs on the pavement outside. Once there, Mr. Gruber settled back and listened patiently, while Paddington did his best to explain all that had taken place that day. It was a long story, and at the finish, Mr. Gruber looked as surprised at the outcome as Paddington had done. "What a bit of luck that old sewing machine I gave you turned out to be so valuable," he said. "I would never have guessed it. It only goes to show that even in this business there's always something to learn." "The man from So Right said it's one of their Mark's ones," Mr. Gruber replied Paddington impressively. "He told me it must have been one of the first they ever made. They've been trying to find one like it for years to put it in their museum, so it's probably worth a lot of money." "It's a good job they offered to repair Mr. Curry's trousers free of charge," chuckled Mr. Gruber, pouring out a second cup of cocoa by way of celebration. "We should never have heard the last of it otherwise. It seems to me you struck a very lucky bargain, Mr. Brown." "Just think," he mused, "if you hadn't accidentally dropped your bun money down a drain, all this might never have happened. Big things sometimes have very small beginnings indeed." Paddington nodded his agreement behind the cocoa steam, and then hesitated as he felt in his duffel coat pocket. Mr. Gruber read his thoughts. "I don't think it would be quite the same if you deliberately put some money down a drain, Mr. Brown," he said tactfully. "After all, I know lightning seldom strikes twice in the same place, but fate plays funny tricks sometimes." Paddington considered the matter for a moment. All in all, he decided Mr. Gruber was quite right, and it wasn't worth taking any unnecessary risks. "I don't think I should like to see even Mr. Curry's trousers struck by lightning," he announced, "especially while they're still at the mender's."